I'm gonna make every Brawl Stars cover realistic using Photoshop. I have a series on this channel where I turn popular app covers realistic, and in one of the videos I turned this cover realistic, and a lot of you seem to like it, but I didn't know that this cover was actually logo number 16. So today I'm gonna take every single cover they've ever had up until the most recent Toy Story update, and I'm gonna make them realistic, starting with when the game was first released in 2018. I made a circle and warped it to be the same size as the one in the cover, and then made shapes for the different colors on the outside. Once I finished that, I duplicated the circle in the middle and made it fit with the original. But next, I'll add some dirt in the hole and make it a bit darker. And I also put a metal texture on all the outside parts, and once they were all the right color, I added the same skull from the Angels and Demons cover I made and removed the green tint. After that, I made the skull yellow and added a bunch of shadows around the edges and also made it darker since I'm interpreting this as a whole. I made the ground a little darker, but this is my realistic version of the first cover. But it's only gonna get better because I have 15 more logos to make and they just keep getting cooler. So let's go on to the next cover, which was changed for Halloween in 2019. So that's why this is the cover. And luckily for both of us, I saved the original template I made so I don't have to remake everything every single time, which would probably get a little bit boring. So I changed the color of the skull and then changed the color of the shapes around it. The bottom of the skull is kind of cut off here, so I cut out that section in the teeth and made it less smooth and then added some more shadows. And that's basically everything. So this is the realistic version of the second cover. The next cover was a themed update for 2020, and all I really had to do was cut an eye patch out and then add it onto the skull with some shadows, and this is the finished cover. This smiley face cover was for the next big update in 2020, which was called Starr Park, and the colors are a little bit different in this one, so I changed those first and then made a circle to replicate the skull. Next, I added some eyes and some shadows, but then I added a skull kind of texture on top, and after that, I added the texture to the eyes and also added some depth to the holes in the eyes with the brush tool, along with some shadows on the inside. I added the mouth and did the same thing I did with the eyes and added a lot more shadows and then a camera raw filter. And this is my realistic version of the Starr Park cover. Cover number 5 was another Halloween update in 2022 called Ghost Station, and I'm just gonna do the same thing I did with the last cover, so I copied the character and added some shadows as well as the same skull texture from the last cover. I basically did the same thing with the eyes and mouth. I added another texture on top of the ghost skull thing, and that's pretty much it. So here's the realistic version of the Ghost Station cover. This next update was for the Candyland update at the very end of 2022, and I started by retracing the pattern on the outside with the brush tool. Once I finished with that, I started adding the textures onto the different colors. I added the skull and traced around the orange parts to get a similar pattern to the original cover and then colored it in. I did the same with the other side, and that was basically it. So here's the finished Candyland cover. The next cover came out pretty early in 2023, and I actually couldn't find a good picture of this one on the internet, so the cover you're looking at, I actually had to make in Photoshop. But this one was pretty easy because all I had to do was make it black and white to match the original, and that was pretty much it. So here's the cover. Moving on to some of the cooler covers, the next cover change was for the Rumble Jungle update, so they made a jungle theme, and this is definitely one of the cooler ones in my opinion. So I started by changing all the colors on the outside, and once I finished that, I changed the color of the skull and made the inside parts more green and dark. But next, I added a bunch of leaves in the same position as the leaves in the original, and then changed all the colors. I added some shadows below the leaves, and then made it more dark around the edges. Finally, I added the little cuts in the leaves, and that's pretty much it. So here's the realistic version of the Rumble Jungle cover. This cover was for the Enchanted Woods update, which was a few months after the last one, but I started by changing the colors of the outside, which was a little hard to see at some points, but after that was done, I added a cement texture and then started cutting out this butterfly from the background. I added the butterfly to the main image and then made it glow, but next I added some glowing circles because I think these are fireflies, and then I also added some blue onto the skull. I made the skull a lot darker with some shadows and then added some more texture with the camera raw filter. So this is the Enchanted Woods cover, but realistic. This next cover happened sometime between July and October of 2023, but this is probably in my top 3 favorites, so let's make it even cooler, but realistic. I used the pen tool to recreate the background, and once that was done, I made the skull more pink and added a pink inner glow. I used the pen tool again to recreate the shapes of all 3 leaves, and then made the outsides more bright. To make them look better, I added a leaf texture on top, and since this cover has a lot of lightning, I didn't want to just do the same thing as the last one and add some fireflies, so I added a little spark instead, but I ended up changing that later. I went back around the leaves with a sharp brush to make it less round and more realistic, and after that I added an electric spark on the right and made it glow a little more. I added a cement texture to the background and then used a new lightning brush that I downloaded to make the lightning on top of the skull. After placing all the lightning, I removed some unneeded parts and then moved a few other parts. And then I went around the skull and added some pink lighting around it. And I also added some more highlights around the end of the lightning rods. But then I decided to just make the contact point really bright. I added some pink lighting to the ground and also inside the nose and eyes to make it kind of look like it's glowing on the inside. But finally, I'll add a camera raw filter and now it's done. So this is my realistic remake. For Halloween in 2023, the cover was changed to this clown. So I started by making the hole in the middle because it looked more like a platform than the ground in this cover, so I made it purple and then added a texture so it's not just flat. I adjusted the shadows below the skull and then cut out the parts of the teeth that are missing in the original, but it looked kind of weird, so I went back and made the cutout seem a little more normal, and after that I added some green onto the skull above the eyes and set the blending mode to soft light. I also added some black to the eyes of the skull and some below it as well, and I'm imagining this is just makeup, but on a skull. But what I don't think is makeup is the red ball on the nose. I'm imagining it's like one of those balls that the CVS gives out for Red Nose Day, which a lot of people actually seem to have a problem with. But I need to cut out the ball first, so after I do that, I'll put it on top of the skull and then add a bunch of shadows. Finally, I started working on the outside, which was pretty easy since it's only 2 colors. So once I finished with the pattern, I added the metal texture and warped it a little bit. I added a camera raw filter and then made a little vignette, so this is the final cover. I actually really like this redesign. It's kind of creepy, which doesn't make me think of Brawl Stars, which I think is actually pretty cool. But let's move on to the next cover, which was the final update in 2023, and it was called Star Tunes. And this is what they changed the cover to, which is probably inspired by Looney Tunes. And while I recreate the background on the screen, I just want to explain that this cover really confused me on where things were, because usually the cover is a hole with a skull in it. But with this cover, I don't know if this layer is above this one, or if this layer is above this. My brain hurts right now. But anyways, that's pretty much it. So here's the realistic cover. I'm not a big fan of it, but that's probably because I'm still confused. So let's move on to the next cover, which was the first update of 2024. This update was a ranked update, and they had a blue and red theme for it, so let's make it realistic. This cover has a lot of different shades of blue and a lot of different shades of red, so that was kind of a pain to do, but it also has a few dips right here, which once again is kind of confusing, but I think these both go down because the lighting is coming from the top. I also think that because of the highlight on the top of the skull right here. But now that I've finished the blue side, I'm going to color in the red side with the correct colors. Once that was done, I noticed that there's some highlights on the darker parts near the bottom, so I replicated that on my cover and then added all of the textures. I know the eyes are a little bit different on this one, but I don't think your skull can actually do that, so here's my realistic cover. The next update was a collab with Godzilla, and they made a pretty cool cover, so let's turn it realistic. And I started by removing the parts on the outside that are removed on the original icon. Once I finished with that, I used the brush tool to draw the lighter part, and then added a texture and some shadows to the top of the image. I changed the color of the skull and then made the outside of the eyes and nose more bright. Next, I made the skull more bright and then started cutting out the eye hole on the forehead. I added the same skull behind it to make it look like it's the back of the skull, and then drew on the top side to give it some depth. So this is the realistic Godzilla icon. The next update came in August of 2024, and it was another collab, but this time with SpongeBob. So first, I recreated the gradient on the background and then changed the color on the circle in the middle. After that, I added some water to the hole and put a cement texture on the outside. Next, I used a spray paint brush to color the flower clouds onto the cement. Once I finished that, I copied the shape of the skull and then added the lighter parts on the eyes and the nose. I'm also going to color in all the holes with the brush tool because this is technically a sponge in the shape of a skull. So after that, I gave the holes some more depth and then added a sponge texture on top of it. I changed the blending mode and then added the sponge texture to the holes as well. I made the outside a little darker, and that's pretty much it. So here's the realistic SpongeBob cover. The next update came at the beginning of October, but I already made this in that previous video I talked about, so if you want to see me design that one, you're gonna have to watch that video. But I do still really like this cover. It's definitely one of my favorites. But let's move on to the final cover, which was a collab with Toy Story in December of 2024. My camera just died. I know you guys don't care about my face anyways, so I'm just gonna continue this. I started off by changing the color of the circle in the middle and removing the shadows on the skull. I added a texture to the middle part as well as a bevel and emboss, and then some shadows on the bottom part, because I'm imagining for this logo that the circle goes up. Since these are cut off, it must be behind the circle. So next, I used some rectangles to recreate the different parts of the background. I added the metal texture on top of it and then made some rounded rectangles to recreate these things. I duplicated it 2 times and changed the colors and then added the cement texture on top of them. I added some shadows near the bottom of the skull and then added a camera raw filter. And finally, I adjusted the hue and saturation, and this is my final cover. These are all the covers I made, so let me know which is your favorite in the comments. This was pretty fun, and I learned some new skills while doing it, so if you want to see more, subscribe.